Back again, Bergson and the Holographic Theory of Mind. Part 47, Kant versus the Wasp, or Bergson's analysis of Kant in Creative Evolution. We'll see a big picture, the Greek view of science, mind, and world, and then the Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza modification reacting to the new science of Galileo, Kepler et al. And Kant's further modification of these, his critique, but in reality, nothing actually changed. Time is still buried. There's still a deep misconception of mind. So the wasp will still be unexplained. For mind is greater than intellect, and intuition plus intellect is that which will support the new science. Heidegger, number 27, we noted that here Heidegger is considered by philosophy the greatest of the 20th century. Perhaps Wittgenstein is allowed to slip in here. But Herr Kant, perhaps the greatest, the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Judgement, they resonate with awe. These works rode on the great wave of Galileo, Kepler, Newton, the new science. Then Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, and Kant. They represented philosophy's effort to incorporate the science into an overall view of the nature of our knowledge, the universe, mind, God. It's thought that all this constituted a break from the classical system of the Greeks, but no true break was made. The wrong path was taken. The source and nature of the knowledge of the wasp, their mysterious understanding of the cricket, the caterpillar. Remember, the wasp knows mysteriously the 9 precise points to sting that caterpillar such that it remains alive so the wasp larvae can eat it. Or the cricket, the 3 precise points to paralyze the cricket, yet keep it alive. Where did this knowledge come from? This will be untouched when Kant is done. In Kant, the concept of space plays the critical role in understanding mind. To quote, intelligence as Kant represents it to us is bathed in an atmosphere of spatiality, to which it is as inseparably united as the living body to the air it breathes. Again, spatiality, we're talking about abstract spatiality. Now, there are 2 sections in Creative Evolution where Bergson discusses Kant. The above quote is near the start of the first section, and just before this, there is the, as usual, few pages with oblique reference to concepts in matter and memory. In this case, in retrospect, holographic vision of the universal field. It is simplest, given all that we've discussed before in previous videos, to simply describe this framework again, and again, number 46 is good for this. For it all starts with extension. What actually is spatial extension? Here we are introduced to a fundamental inversion, as Bergson discusses it, with respect to how we think about space. To quote, but suppose for a moment that matter consists in this very movement pushed further, and that physics is simply psychics inverted. So we're introduced to the notion that the psychical aspect of the universal field is pushing forth, shall we say, the physical aspect. And it will help us here if we remember that this is creative evolution, and that we're envisioning the impetus within of consciousness that is within the psychical, which is pushing forth things into form, that is a source of creation. This is equally into space, into matter. To quote, the idea that it, that is mind, forms a pure space, that is of abstract space, is only the schema of the limit at which this movement would end, but it never actually gets to this end. Abstract space is an ideal limit that is never reached in the physical world, in the actual world. And, he says, once in possession of the form of space, mind uses it like a net with meshes that can be made and unmade at will, which thrown over matter divides it as the needs of action demand. So as we've seen, discussed before in the matter and memory context, our perception, is oriented toward action, thus carving out objects in which our body can act. Then we distinguish within this transforming field objects and motions, this concept, objects and motions, objects moving in the field. And then we verify this through the continuum of points or positions. And this continuum is infinitely divisible. It's a continuum of 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension, the time dimension of instants. All 3 dimensions, or 4 dimensions, being infinitely divisible. We can break these dimensions up as tiny as we like and can recompose them at will. To go on. Thus, the space of our geometry and spatiality of things are mutually engendered by the reciprocal action and reaction of 2 terms, which are essentially the same, but which move in the direction inverse to each other. The 2 terms, poles, aspects of the universal field, the psychical and the physical, as Bergson's envisioning this. No, they're essentially the same. They're aspects of one field, one continuum, but they move in inverse direction to each other. And neither is space so foreign to our nature as we imagine, nor is matter as completely extended in space as our senses and intellect represent it. As usually notes, the first point he's, quote, discussed elsewhere, that is, in matter and memory. As to the second, he says, we limit ourselves to pointing out that perfect spatiality would consist in a perfect externality of parts in their relation to one another, that is to say, in complete reciprocal independence. Just like those blocks there moving, they're considered completely, perfectly independent of each other, without relation, totally spatially distinct. And then back to the holographic kicker of matter and memory, he says, now, there is no material point that does not act on every other material point. When we observe that a thing really is there where it acts, we shall be led to say, as Faraday was, that all the atoms interpenetrate, and each of them fills the world. In other words, he's hearkening back to this critical paragraph of matter and memory we've noted many times, the holographic statement of the universe. But is it not obvious that the photograph, if photograph there be, that is no photograph in the brain, but rather is in the physical world, is already taken, already developed in the very heart of things, and at all points in space. No metaphysics, no physics can escape this conclusion. Skipping down, bring in Faraday's centers of force, the lines of force emitted in every direction from every center, bring to bear upon each the influence of the whole material world. This is Bergson's holographic conception stated in matter and memory, critical to his theory of perception. This is backing this little statement in page 203 of Creative Evolution. To continue, on such an hypothesis, the atom, or more generally, the material point, becomes simply a view of the mind, a view which we come to take when we continue far enough the work, wholly relative to the faculty of acting by which we subdivide matter into bodies, or the little blocks moving there, or the points to atoms, etc. He notes that it is undeniable that matter lends itself to this subdivision. Those blocks indeed can act and look precisely totally separate as the atoms, but they do not have the precise outlines our perception, that is, our abstraction of these blocks based on our possible action, gives to them. Nothing is that distinct from every other thing in this universe. So yes, our science can construct itself based on the apparent separability and with no appreciable error, until, we'll see, science moves away from the inert matter and towards the living, that is, towards the sciences of biology and psychology. He says, what else can this mean but that matter extends itself in space without being absolutely extended, not to the extent of abstract space therein, and that in regarding matter as decomposable into isolated systems, in attributing to it quite distinct elements which change in relation to each other without changing in themselves, which are displaced, shall we say, without being altered. In short, conferring on matter the properties of pure space, we are transporting ourselves to the terminal point of the movement of which matter simply indicates the direction. So he's always saying here, in the pure notion of abstract space, the continuum, infinitely divisible, the points of positions, extending itself to time, we're going too far. That continuum does not actually exist. Again, are those blocks unchanging? Or the motion, or the cups when they move? No, only practically unchanging. So displaced without being altered must again be placed in the context of matter and memory. Again, he says, though we are free to attribute rest or motion, this relativity, to any material point taken by itself, it is nonetheless true that the aspect of the material universe changes, that the internal configuration of every real system varies, and that we have here no longer the choice between mobility and rest. Movement, whatever its inner nature, becomes an indisputable reality. That is, the movement of the rose, the organic motion and growth of the rose or the tree, is an indisputable reality that cannot be relativized. We may not be able to say what parts of the whole are in motion. Motion there is in the whole nonetheless. You cannot reduce the rose or the tree to a motionless state depending on the motions of observers, which is the logical conclusion of the abstract continuum. Relativity being simply the expression of the logic therein. There must be real motion. Stars explode, roses bloom, trees blow, real motion. And these are simultaneities. Parts of these motions cannot be relativized. Their simultaneity is intrinsically part of the motion of the whole entire field. He goes on, of what object? Again, we're in matter and memory. That which sits behind creative evolution. Of what object externally perceived can be said that it moves? Of what other that it remains motionless? To put such a question is to admit the discontinuity established by common sense between objects independent of each other, like those blocks, having each its individuality comparable to kinds of persons. That is a valid distinction. For on the contrary hypothesis, the question would be no longer how are produced in given parts of matter changes of position, like the blocks or the cup, but how is affected in the whole a change of aspect. And he compared this motion to that of a kaleidoscope. Within the global motion of this whole, the motions of objects now become changes or transfers of state, like waves in an ocean. So in reality, those motions are also changes or transfers of state within the global motion of the whole. We just choose to treat them as entirely independent of the whole, and as though none of those things are changing internally while they're doing so. So now, back to Kant. So Bergson says, what the transcendental aesthetic of Kant appears to have established once and for all is that extension is not a material attribute of the same kind as others. Now, transcendental aesthetic. By aesthetics, this is used by Kant in his etymological sense. Aesthesis means sensation or sensitive perception. So we're going to be transcending perception a bit in Kant's mind. He notes, Bergson does, we can't reason indefinitely about heat or color or weight without ultimately verifying by our experience. That is, we're going to have to touch that fire ultimately to make sure that it's indeed as hot as we think it is. Experience. But space, that is abstract space, that's another story. Space, he says, is remarkable that our mind, speculating on it, with its powers alone, cuts it out a priori. Figures whose properties we determine a priori experience with which we have not kept in touch, yet follows us through the infinite complications of our reasoning, like those equations up there, and invariably justifies them. Yes, Kant made this clear, but is his explanation of it right? As we noted earlier, intelligence, as Kant represents it to us, is bathed in an atmosphere of spatiality. Our perceptions reach us only after having passed through this atmosphere, our perception of the cup, the coffee cup, the blocks, etc. There is an atmosphere. It's the abstract space that the coffee cup has to penetrate through. They have been impregnated by our geometry, so that our faculty of thinking only finds itself in matter, the mathematical properties which our faculty of perceiving is already deposed there. And so we come to the famous thing in itself of Kant. But this matter, in all that it has that is intelligible, is our own work. Of the reality in itself, we know nothing, since we only get its refraction to the form of our faculty of perceiving, that is, the abstract space of Kant. This is what inspired Kant with his peremptory refutation of empiricist theories of knowledge. For example, Hume. By the way, in Creative Evolution, around here, Bergson says so-called empiricist theories. Why does he say so-called? Because, as we'll see, our science does not meet the mark, the criterion for a science, by truly employing intuition. So it's not truly penetrating the empirical. But, he says, with Kant, space is given as a ready-made form of our perceptive faculty, a veritable deus ex machina, a god descending on the stage from a machine, of which we see neither how it arises nor why it is what it is. Things in themselves are also given, of which he claims we can know nothing. By what right, then, can we affirm their existence, even as, quote, problematic, unquote? The unknowable reality projects into our perceptual system. It projects a sensuous manifold. This exactly fits, like puzzle pieces, into this system. Yet this fit would seem a pre-established harmony, and Kant wants to avoid this. That is, somehow all of the forms of the external world, the coffee cup, are fitting this intellectual space that Kant is proposing. At bottom, it is not for having distinguished degrees. It is for not having distinguished degrees in spatiality that he has taken to space ready-made as a given. Whence the question, how the sensuous manifold is adapted to it. Again, Kant has taken the notion of space too far, to the limit that does not actually exist in the physical world. It is for the same reason that he has supposed matter wholly developed into parts absolutely external to one another, the perfect coincidence of matter with geometrical space. So Kant presumed for a theory of knowledge only three alternatives. Mind is determined by things. Things are determined by mind. Between mind and things, a mysterious agreement. There is a fourth. For Kant did not think mind overflows the intellect, nor did he attribute to duration, that is, concrete time, indivisibly flowing time, an absolute existence, for he put time on the same plane as space, as usual. The fourth alternative, the intellect is a special function of mind, essentially turned toward matter. It is not the all of mind, essentially turned toward matter, to the physical, to that treatment by which we look at things as individual blocks in specified mathematical motion, and having progressively adapted to one another to a common form. Remember, in Bergson's holographic framework, the brain, as a reconstructive wave, is already specifying a time-scale aspect of mind, universal mind, the holographic field with its elementary properties of mind. And that is being specified as our perception. So we are participants already, the brain, integrally in the field and projecting already or specifying a form of mind. Our science, our knowledge, is approximate then, but not relative in Bergson's conception. Our perception, whose role it is to light up our actions, works a dividing up of matter that is always too sharply defined, always subordinated to practical needs, consequently always requiring division. I note there in the bottom right, the quote from Matter Memory. A theory of matter is an attempt to find the reality hidden beneath customary images, which are entirely relative to our needs. That is, we're trying to break beyond a theory of matter that's based purely on our perception, dividing up bodies initially into independent bodies and then ultimately into the continuum of points and positions. For a scientific theory to be final, the mind would have to embrace the totality of things in block and place each thing in relation to every other thing. But in reality, we are obliged to consider problems one by one, and thus provisional. That's just the way it is. In principle, positive science bears on reality itself, provided it does not overstep the limits of its own domain, which is inert matter. But this is a problem. Science routinely steps beyond this domain. Bergson returns to Kant in chapter 4, that is the last chapter of Creative Evolution. This is after treating the Greek conception of being and science, that is the philosophy of forms, and then the nature of the modern revolution in science, that is Galileo, Kepler, the modification of the Greek conception of science, and the philosophical effort to embrace this, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza. Now we can't go into the level this actually deserves because it's an incredible analysis, but I'm going to sum it up in a brief way, and we'll be back to Kant by slide 21. What we're going to see, nothing truly changed from the Greeks. A choice point was there for Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, and Kant as well. They took the wrong path, and Kant reinforced it. So the Greeks, the philosophy of forms. Our natural view of becoming is this cinematograph, as Bergson called it, the cinematographic method of thought. We simply project a series of slices of emotion via the projector. We can create a very nice motion if we divide the motion of the car finely enough into fine enough slices. And that's how we like to look at motion. But the actual movement of the car slips through the interval between each slice, because every attempt to reconstitute change out of states implies the absurd proposition and absurdity that movement is made of immobilities. Now I'm going to say, I've seen people take the cinematographic method discussion that Bergson has in Creative Evolution and think that somehow he's saying this is the way things are. No, he's saying this is simply our improper way of looking at motion. Now, philosophy saw this from the start. It was Zeno and Zeno's paradoxes. The arrow, for example, never moves because why? Well, it's always coincident with a static point on that static continuum of points and positions. Achilles, he's always having the distance with each step, but by that motion, by the method, he never gets to the tortoise. In both cases, in fact, all cases of these paradoxes of Zeno, we're focusing on the space, the infinitely divisible space that's being traversed. So we can cut this space up infinitely that Achilles is traversing. And likewise, the space the arrow is traversing into an infinity of points. Static points, not motion. Simply extend Zeno to qualitative and evolutionary becoming. Human growth becomes a series of stops, stages, snapshots, infancy, youth, old age. These are cuts, slices, taken along an indivisible transition. But the cinematograph, the projector, that is far more natural to the intellect. We can imagine taking the growth of our guy there and slicing it up extremely finely from infant to old age, and we could project that again up on our projector very nicely and get a nice apparent growing motion. That's our preferred way of thinking about it. And for the Greeks, rather than lay the blame on the attitude of thought and language toward the course of things on thought, they preferred to pronounce the course of things itself to be wrong. So spatial movement in the Greek thought, all change, all becoming, was declared an illusion. The Greek idea, eidos, in this context, the context of the Greek thought, is best translated as view or moment, says Bergson. It is the stable view of instability or change, and the form is simply a moment of evolution. To reduce things to ideas is therefore to resolve becoming into its principal moments, the principal moments, each of these being, moreover, screened from the laws of time and, as it were, plucked out of eternity. If we start from immutable ideas, here's the problem. There is yet becoming. There is that growth. How do you get becoming? To derive becoming, we get there by diminution. That is, we degrade the immutable ideas. And that then becomes change, the pure degradation or diminution of the immortal, immutable, unchangeable idea. At the base of ancient philosophy is this postulate: there is more in the motionless than in the moving. Thus, the ideas or forms are the whole of intelligible reality. They represent altogether the theoretical equilibrium of being. Being becomes one vast idea at a single moment, that is eternity. As Plato and Aristotle goes in this discussion, this is going to be sufficient. To quote, so having begun by refusing to ideas an independent existence, which Aristotle did, and finding himself nevertheless unable to deprive them of it, Aristotle pressed them into each other, rolled them up into a ball, and set above the physical world a form that was thus found to be the form of forms, the idea of ideas. All this was reflected in ancient science. Ancient science thinks it knows its object sufficiently when it has noted of it some privileged moments. A falling body. We're near enough to the notion of falling motion if we characterize it as a whole. It is a movement downward. It has a tendency to a center. It is a natural movement to, quote, return to its place. The rest of the passage, all the intervening moments, of no real interest to ancient thought or ancient science. Whereas modern science considers the object at any moment whatsoever. Galileo, there's no essential moment, no privileged instance. The true science of gravity will determine at any moment of time the position of a body in space. So notice the ball is rolling down the inclined plane of Galileo there. We're noting the distance moved at each second, each t there on the left-hand column. So second by second, we're noting the position, and we're deriving a formula that expresses that. We may say, then, that our physics differs from that of the ancients in the indefinite breaking up of time. In the ancients, the horse in the Parthenon was a moment, radiating motion. A privileged moment is somehow a concept, an idea that seemed to radiate the motion of the horse. But the new science, the cinematograph of instants, is in full force. Again, we're projecting instant by instant. Secondly, we have the primacy of laws in the new science, dynamic laws. Archimedes, his law there for flotation is a static law. It's simply relating statically density, weight, displacement. Kepler, we have a dynamic law, the relation between areas described by the sun-centered radius vector of a planet and the time employed in describing them. Now, that's the planet is emitting equal areas per unit time, or tracing equal areas per unit time. For Galileo, we have a law connecting this space traversed with time. That is, S distance is proportional to t squared. Now, Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza were to embrace this change. One can see in the last slide that this would have been a massive effect on the psyche of people, this precise description of motion. Descartes was ambiguous. He was caught between two paths. One, the universe's mechanism where all is given. And secondly, indeterminism, for he believed in the free will of man. Now, this all is given. There's a couple of different meanings of all is given. Firstly, if we have our continuum of points positions, again, as we move the cup, each position, each cup corresponding to an instant, it also is corresponding to an instantaneous cube of the all of space, in which the position of the cup is held at some particular instant. And this, of course, is unrolling. Each block is going to the next by a very deterministic law. The position of that cup is determined by a very deterministic law, just as our billiard balls are. This, of course, also leads with a little bit of relativistic thought to the space-time block, where all is given, past, present, or future. So all is given in both senses. The mechanistic sense, that each succeeding block of space is determined by the previous block. And then secondly, that it's all laid out in essence in eternity, so we say. But Descartes superimposed his hope for indeterminism and the free will of man on the mechanistic structure. And he supported a God unceasingly renewing the creative act by his absolute reality, thus sustaining becoming. So Descartes' God would have been creating the cube, next cube after next cube after next cube. In fact, if the cubes are indeed static, frozen, there's no way to get the next cube without a God. I've discussed that before. Now, Leibniz, Spinoza, in them, the old Greek structure is renewed, but seen through the Cartesian mechanism. The difficulty they now faced, Aristotle had condensed things, concepts, outside reality. In the new mechanism, laws and relations must be condensed. A law relates to changing terms, like sun and planet. And that law has to be immanent, totally embedded integrally in what it governs, that is, in the physical world with that sun and planet. So the roll-up or condensing principle, if you're going to roll it up into some abstract form or principle, can't be transcendent to sensible reality. We would have to suppose this principle is both in and out of sensible reality and in and out of time, yet condemned to wind out time or the physical world in an endless chain. To quote Bergson, rather than formulate so appalling a contradiction, the philosophers were necessarily led to sacrifice the weaker of the two terms and to regard the temporal aspect of things as a mere illusion. We're back to the Greeks. Leibniz did so explicitly. Time is made a confused perception. Time, in essence, consists of all the points of view a monad can consume or assume towards itself, but this is a static conception. Spinoza is less clear, says Bergson. He appeared to wish a relation between the eternal and duration, that is the unfolding or becoming of time, as though between the essence and the accidental of Aristotle, or between Spinoza's the adequate and the inadequate, equivalent to the essence and accidental. And this just veers toward Aristotelian. For both new and old, for both, reality as well as truth are integrally given in eternity. both are opposed to the idea of a reality that creates gradually. That is, both at bottom are opposed to an absolute duration, that is, concrete, becoming an indivisible flow, or becoming. So Kant, too, as we come back to Kant, is imbued with the belief in a science, single, complete, embracing the whole of the real. His critique, need we place this unity in God, as Leibniz and Spinoza did? Can we just go partly on this for the new science? For the ancients, science applied to concepts, that is to say, to kinds of things. And compressing all concepts into one, they therefore necessarily arrived at a being which was rather thought object than thought subject, static. But modern science turns on laws, on relations, as we've seen. And a relation is a bond between two terms established by mind. The universe can only be a system of laws if phenomena have been filtered beforehand through an intellect. The intellect need not be God. The human intellect is enough. This is Kant's solution. Stopped thereby by this move, the slide back to the Greek metaphysics. True, when he speaks of the human intellect, he means neither yours nor mine. The unity of nature comes indeed from the human understanding that unifies, but the unifying function is impersonal. It does not exactly lie within man. Rather, man lies within it, as an atmosphere of intellectuality, which his consciousness breathes. It is, if we will, a formal God, something that in Kant is not yet divine, but which tends to become so. To accept the conception of science of Leibniz, Spinoza, but to check the dogmatism sliding toward God, that's one thing. But the distinction between the matter of knowledge and its form, that's another. For Kant, intelligence is preeminently a faculty of establishing relations. And Kant attributed an extra-intellectual origin, extra-intellectual, to the terms between which the relations are established. So breaking from Leibniz and Spinoza, knowledge is not entirely resolvable in terms of intelligence for Kant. And so he was bringing back an essential element of Descartes, abandoned by the Cartesians. Remember Kant's ambiguous wish and desire to bring back a God. Thereby, Kant prepared the way for a new philosophy, which might have established itself in the extra-intellectual matter of knowledge by a higher effort of intuition. Coinciding with this matter, adopting the same rhythm and the same movement, might not consciousness, by two efforts in the opposite direction, from within, from without, be able to grasp from within and no longer perceive solely from without, the two forms of reality, body and mind, again, merging with the essence of the fly, of the wasp and the caterpillar, penetrating that essence, but then looking at it from without in terms of the intellect in abstract space. Continuing, would not this twofold effort make us, as far as possible, relive the absolute? That is, take us to the thing in itself, or better, the flow in itself, absolute knowledge. Moreover, as in the course of this operation, we see intellect spring up of itself, cut itself out in the whole of mind. In other words, intellect is part of mind, but not the whole of mind. Intellectual knowledge would then appear as it is, limited, but not relative, because it's participating in the very flow of and development of the universe itself. As I noted in slide 12, in Bergson's reconstructive holographic wave model, the specification, that is perception, is a specification of an aspect of the whole transforming field, which has the attributes of mind. The field transforming indivisibly like a kaleidoscope, objects and motions in this field being transfers of state within this global motion, and then our perception, oriented as it is toward action, the body's action, carving out objects, and then objects and motions in this field verifying this to the continuum of points or positions, and therefore the 3D or 4D continuum infinitely divisible. But again, this aspect, abstract space of perception, is an aspect of perception itself, a cutout, shall we say, from perception itself being a specification of a part of mind. So such was the direction that Kantianism might have pointed out to a vivified Cartesianism, but in this direction Kant himself did not go. He would not, he could not. There could be no cutting out of intellect from the whole of mind. For to Kant, intellect is coextensive with matter, that is with that transforming field, or even less extensive. The intellect imposes its form on matter. The thing in itself is only a refraction through this atmosphere, this intellectual atmosphere. Why? Why did he not believe the matter of knowledge, which is to say that the whole physical universal field extends beyond or overflows its form, his little cloud? He took for granted the idea of a science that is one, capable of binding with the same force all the parts of what is given, and of coordinating them into a system presented on all sides in equal solidity. In other words, his structure would have been, shall we say, a three-sided solid cube, physics, biology, and psychology. I put Sam Harris there because he could probably use some psychological work. He did not consider in his Critique of Pure Reason that science became less and less objective, more and more symbolical, to the extent that it went from the physical to the vital, and then from the vital to the psychical. But for Kant, there is one experience. Intellect covers it all. Intuition, that is the sensuous, is infra-intellectual. To our perception, is infra-intellectual. But if science becomes less and less objective, as we make that movement from physics to biology to psychology, to first perceive the vital, then the psychical, and then to symbolize this, intuition is needed. This would transcend the intellect, though ultimately being translated by it. But Kant could have nothing to do with this form of supra-intellectual intuition. This intuition is based in Bergson's principle. Subject and object are differentiated in terms of time, not space. That is, the body/brain is integrally part of one field. That is, there's no true spatial distinction, again, between the body and the field in which it's embedded. And this field is transforming indivisibly. It's time as duration, as indivisible flow. All of this providing the basis for consciousness and the specification by the brain as a reconstructive way of an aspect of this consciousness. So he goes on, in order to admit it, to regard duration as the very stuff of reality, and consequently to distinguish between the substantial duration of things and time spread out in space. Again, to take those two phrases in there, firstly, time spread out in space. We've seen this one more time. Again, we can take the cup, take a trajectory beneath the cup's motion, divided into an infinity of points, where each point then, in essence, corresponds to an instantaneous snapshot of the entire universe with the cup in it, at time after time, point after point, instant after instant. This can become a vast four-dimensional structure, depending on how many cubes, how finely you want to slice that trajectory into points. So it's a vast 4D space spread out. And of course, we could play it with our cinematographical method at an infinite pace or very slow. But again, it's just a giant spread out in space structure. Secondly, as opposed to that structure, we have duration as the very stuff of reality. And in this passage, Bergson notes, we must wait for the sugar in that cup to dissolve. We're forced to wait. Only in that abstract space, that massive four-dimensional structure we want to make of cubes, can the sugar dissolution or dissolving be sped up or slowed down, say via our cinematographical method. Because otherwise we must wait, because the universe actually transforms at a certain pace. That is, he says, time is a force, as opposed to this abstraction, this 4D abstraction. Time is a real force. It's the unfolding of the universe. We'll come back to this in a moment. So he goes on, it would be necessary to regard space itself and the geometry which is immanent in space as an ideal limit. Again, each cube, instantaneous cube, a frozen instant static, is an ideal limit which does not exist. So an ideal limit in the direction in which material things develop, but which they do not actually attain. Nothing, he says, could be more contrary to the letter and perhaps also to the spirit of the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant just could not go this other direction, away from time spread out in space. So in this context of the cup, Bergson makes the statement, the duration of the universe, my friends here are brackets, the paced unfolding, must therefore be one with the latitude of creation, which can find place in it. So again, remember, this is creative evolution, and we're dealing with the creation of forms, but we're equally dealing with the creation of acts, even just to move a page, to free will move a page, to create that act, or for me to press the mouse, whatever. This is what's underlying creation at all of these levels. The duration of the universe must be one with the latitude of creation. So this paced unfolding, time as a force, is equally and symmetrically beneath the possibility of creativity. This is a profound statement in creative evolution. And I'd have to do another video that was focused precisely at unfolding the meaning of the statement. But we'll let that sit as it is there. And I just note this. This is a profound piece of creative evolution. And so, says Bergson, no doubt knowledge is present to us in it as an ever-open role. Experience is a push of facts that is ever going on as the universe unfolds. But according to Kant, these facts are spread out on one plane as fast as they arise. They are external to each other and external to the mind. Of a knowledge from within that could grasp them in their springing forth instead of taking them already sprung, that would dig beneath abstract space and spatialized time, there is never any question in Kant's mind about going that way. Yet is indeed beneath this plane that our consciousness places us, that is beneath the abstract space. There flows true duration. There lies the possibility of understanding the caterpillar and the wasp. Remember, as we talked last time, thus the instinctive knowledge that one species possesses of another on a particular point has its root in the very unity of life, a whole sympathetic unto itself. And the feeling of vulnerability might owe its nothing to outward perception, that is of the wasp, but result from the mere presence together of the Amophila, that is a wasp, and the caterpillar, considered no longer as two organisms, but as two activities, two motions in the whole. Kant in his science will never understand the wasps. So a postscript. I ran across a 2019 video by Lex Friedman, who's an MIT professor, AI guy. And Lex has been doing tons of videos, producing them at high velocity with, well, all the intelligentsia of AI and in other fields. In physics, for example. For example, Lee Smolin, Scott Aronson, Chalmers, Kaku, Chomsky, Elon Musk, Jan LeCun, a neural net guy. And so this one was Eric Weinstein. Eric is a PhD in mathematical physics. He coined the term the dark web, which includes himself, people like Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, other people a bit opposed to the establishment. I guess that puts me in the even darker web. And his PhD thesis reads as such: in his dissertation titled Extension of the Self-Dual Yang-Mills Equations Across the Eighth Dimension, Weinstein showed that the self-dual Yang-Mills equations were not really peculiar to dimension 4 and admitted generalizations to higher dimensions. You get the picture. In the interview, Eric just exudes intellect. We put him right there with Kant. And about the 10-minute mark, Lex asked Eric to explain Eric's concept of artificial out-telligence. So Eric says, what I was thinking about is, why are we waiting to be terrified by artificial general intelligence when in fact artificial life is terrifying in itself and it's already here? Now I think, okay, apparently AI's common sense knowledge problem, which is the artificial general intelligence problem, is not going to be a problem. In other words, my construct a mousetrap problem, as I like to illustrate it. And particularly then, well, shall we say, its relationship to consciousness. I doubt that Eric truly grasps what's involved with this problem. But after arguing that AI software has all the elements necessary to create adaptive reproducing systems, which is again quite a stretch, a piece of license, he says, where do we see inanimate, non-intelligent life outwitting intelligent life? Intelligent life. And he has two favorite examples. Example one, the Opry's orchid. It's a type of flower that mimics the female of a pollinator species in order to dupe the males into engaging in what's called pseudocopulation with the fake female, appears to be the lowest petal, and a pheromone component to fool the males. Example two is the Lampsilus mussel, which lives in Missouri streams. It fools bass into biting a fleshy lip that contains its young. And when the bass see this fleshy lip, which looks exactly like a species of fish that the bass like to eat, the young explode and clamp onto the gills and parasitize the bass and get the bass to redistribute them as they eventually release. So what you see there on the right, that little fish is not a fish, it's actually the lip of the mussel, unbelievably. Another picture. You just see the little fish on the lip fish on the mussel there and the bass coming. So this is going to be a bad thing that's going to happen to the bass. He notes in both of these systems, you have a highly intelligent dupe, in this case the bass, being fooled by a lower life form, that is, the mussel. Now comes the old evolutionary adoptive explanation. What is sculpting these convincing lures? It's the intelligence of previously duped targets for these strategies. So when the target is smart enough to avoid the strategy, those weaker mimics fall off, and only the better ones, the mimics, survive. So it's an arms race between the target species being parasitized, like the bass, getting smarter, and this less intelligent or non-intelligent object, a mussel, getting as if smarter, as if smarter. Remember, instinct always looks as if intelligence. So he argues what you see is we don't need AGI for parasitizing. It's simply sufficient for us humans to outwit ourselves, like a Nigerian scam program, which asks for Bitcoin and figures out how to improve itself by analyzing the dupes. So enough of us give the Nigerians a few $1,000 for the dupes, and I guess Nigerian is learning how to better dupe us. But, how is this any different from this? How in heck did the mussel learn this about the bass originally? How is it reproducing itself before? How is it taking care of its young without this mechanism? Just like how was the wasp taking care of his without the caterpillar? In what tiny yet always functional and useful adaptive steps was this lip developed? Such a lip, evolutionary-wise, Darwin mutation-wise, whatever. Just as how did the wasp learn the 9 points of stinging the caterpillar, or the 3 precise points to sting the cricket? By slow evolutionary steps. Same problem with the mousetrap. Irreducible complexity of the behavior itself. This is the intellectual, and the AI intellectual just marching, stomping right over the problems. Just as they cannot tune into the actual problem of common sense knowledge. Yes, it is an utter failure of intuition. Left to themselves, stuck with the Greeks in their metaphysical plane, they will struggle for 1,000 years. And they're too advanced to bother with a discredited vitalist. So of the major philosophers, we look now at Sartre, Kant, Heidegger, contemporary philosophers, Chalmers, Searle, Ad Hoffman, Castrop, Bohm, Tononi, probably a couple others. I know we focused on Searle's Chinese Room. We could be looking at his book Scene, that is his perception theory, but anyone who has watched a chunk of these Bergson videos can, at this point, see through Searle's failure on this subject. And a raft of folks in these areas embodied, embedded, and active and extended ecological predictive processing. One could look at Dennett, but there is no there in Dennett, and one would know where to begin with his problems. In any case, it would be an understatement to say that Bergson is a mirror for their shortcomings. We'll see who comes along to look at that. Down the road, and by the way, I can't resist that quote up there, the ever open role experience. But down the road, yeah, there is another set of philosophers, the hot theory of consciousness, higher order thought. And in reality, I've had this one done for a while, and I think I'll trot it out there. Along with these other two, we'll make it a 45C on the black body, the origin of quanta, supposed end of waves, but we're going to see, well, maybe not so much the end of the wave theory of energy transmission. And 45D, the photoelectric effect, the supposed quantum nail in the wave coffin via Einstein, but maybe not so much a nail. Next time we'll see. Until then, signing off.